Now that you've been introduced to the solid and liquid components of blood, it's time to take a deeper look at each of the specific types of cells that is found within the blood, starting with the red blood cells, which are what we will know as RBCs from this point forward. Now, even though red blood cells are easily one of the most commonly occurring cells in the body because of their function in transporting oxygen, they are actually very different than most of the other types of cells in that they lack two of the most critical organelles that most other types of cells depend on for functioning, although the reason behind this is actually relatively intuitive. Now, red blood cells do not have mitochondria, which is the location of cellular respiration, the chemical reaction that produces energy for all of the cells in the body, well, except for red blood cells. And there is a very logical reason why red blood cells don't have mitochondria, because the job of your red blood cells is to transport oxygen so the rest of the cells in your body can do cellular respiration. But if your red blood cells did cellular respiration, that would mean that they would consume all of the oxygen that they are supposed to be transporting, meaning that this oxygen would never make it to the rest of the body. Now, the interesting thing about red blood cells not having a nucleus means that red blood cells do not actually have their own DNA, and that means that red blood cells cannot actually produce their own proteins, meaning that all of the proteins that are found within red blood cells are actually produced before they become red blood cells. Now, this also means that red blood cells cannot actually repair themselves on their own, which means that any damage that is taken by red blood cells is permanent until the red blood cell is actually broken down and recycled. And this is why basically all of the red blood cells in your body don't last for more than 2 to 3 months before they have to be replaced, because since they don't have a nucleus, they aren't able to produce their own proteins and therefore are not able to fix themselves. So if that's the case, where do red blood cells actually come from? Well, red blood cells are actually produced inside of your bones using special cells which are what we call your bone marrow cells. When red blood cells reach the point where they become irreparably damaged and not able to perform their function, eventually red blood cells make their way to the liver, where white blood cells that are found within the liver actually grab onto broken red blood cells, break them down, recycle the hemoglobin inside of them, and transfer it into new red blood cells so that the whole process can begin again. So where do red blood cells actually come from inside of the bone marrow? Well, inside of the bone marrow are found special types of cells that we call stem cells, and you can actually see stem cells if you are a carnivore and if you specifically enjoy eating chicken. If you take a chicken leg bone and actually break the inside, you can actually see that the bone marrow is quite soft, and what you are looking at are specific examples of stem cells, which are cells that have the ability to differentiate themselves into any other type of blood cell. This means that red blood cells are actually produced using the same cells that produce different types of white blood cells. The decision about whether a stem cell becomes a red blood cell or a white blood cell depends on what type of hormone the stem cell is exposed to. The hormone that is responsible for telling stem cells to become red blood cells is a very important hormone, which is what we call erythropoietin, which I actually need to focus on spelling properly. There we go. Erythropoietin. So erythro is the Greek prefix we learned about previously, which means red. So this is the hormone that is responsible for telling the stem cells in your bone marrow to produce red blood cells rather than different types of white blood cells. And during the process of stem cell differentiation, eventually these cells are going to produce all of the hemoglobin that is needed, which is the most important protein that allows red blood cells to carry their oxygen that they carry. And eventually, once this process is done, they lose their nucleus and all of the other organelles that are necessary for most other cells to survive, and eventually they adopt the characteristic, what we call a biconcave disc shape, meaning that the inside is warped so that the cell membrane faces inward on both sides of the red blood cells, which basically allows them to be streamlined and allows them to move through the liquid part of your blood with less resistance. Now, the final thing that we need to talk about is, of course, the most important protein in the human body, and the protein that makes up basically 96% of the solid mass of red blood cells. That means that hemoglobin represents a much larger percentage of the cell, even more so than the cell membrane. Basically, the only functional protein inside of red blood cells is hemoglobin, and of course it is so important because it can carry 4 oxygen molecules. In this form, this is what we call oxygenated blood when the hemoglobin is carrying oxygen, and when hemoglobin actually allows oxygen to bind, remember that each hemoglobin molecule actually has 4 separate active sites that allows it to bind 4 separate oxygen molecules, and the oxygen is actually going to attach to the iron that is found at the center of each of these active sites. And when the iron in hemoglobin attaches an oxygen, this form of hemoglobin is naturally what we would call oxyhemoglobin, and because of the fact that oxygen binds to iron, most people have the understanding that iron oxide is actually rust, which has a reddish brown color, and because the iron in hemoglobin actually attaches oxygen, this explains why oxyhemoglobin reflects this bright red light and gives red blood cells their characteristic red color. So again, if we see blood that is carrying oxygen, it has this characteristic bright red color that we see here. However, hemoglobin actually has alternate active sites separate from the iron location that binds oxygen that allows each hemoglobin to carry 4 carbon dioxide molecules, and this is what we call deoxygenated blood, meaning that the oxygen, because the prefix De actually means to remove or to break, deoxygenated means that oxygen has been removed and therefore the blood is carrying carbon dioxide instead, in which case the hemoglobin is not oxyhemoglobin. We actually call this carb-amino hemoglobin instead, implying, well, the carb obviously implies that it's carrying carbon dioxide instead, and the amino simply means that the carbon dioxide has attached to a different part of the protein, because amino acids are these molecules that make up protein, and this is why we call this form of hemoglobin carb-amino hemoglobin, that contrary to popular belief is not actually blue. So remember, when we look at circulatory system diagrams, deoxygenated blood is often represented as a blue color, but this is not actually the case in terms of the color of your blood. We can see here that your blood is still red, but it's actually dark red rather than bright red here, but there is still a very visible difference between oxygenated blood and deoxygenated blood, which is simply affected by which molecule, oxygen or carbon dioxide, is being carried by hemoglobin. As to the explanation about why deoxygenated blood is represented as blue, that will be coming in a future video. In the next video, we're going to look at the counterpart cells within the circulatory system that are actually much more complicated in function. In the next video, join us when we discuss the different functions of the white blood cells and the different ways that your body uses white blood cells in order to combat pathogens that make it into your body.